begins the summer of 1987. I was 20 years old. I was a senior and entering my senior year in college. I was studying biomedical engineering at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. I was a captain of my tennis team. I was positioned to be the #1 player that year. And in engineering school at that time, for every 6 guys, there's 1 girl. So I was really popular, cute. I was at the prime of my life. Then I had a dream. The dream was I was in heaven. It was a bright, sunny day in heaven. And there was a line of people standing on a side. And there was sort of a yellow tape, like a guardrail tape. And they were waiting for their relatives to come out of heaven on the other side. And there were U-Haul trucks. The relatives were in U-Haul trucks on the other side. And they opened up, and people came out, and we were holding signs. It was me and I think my mother and uncle. And down came my grandfather, her father, who I've never seen before. He passed before I was born. And he looked young, and he was wearing this kind of oversized suit, and he walked by me, and he reached out his hand to grab me, and I reached out my hand, and we didn't touch. And he gave me this big smile, and he had this chipped tooth. And I turned to my mom, and I said, "He has the same smile as you." And she said, "Yes, he does." And I awoke. And it was such a powerful dream, like the dreams that you're there, you know. And I called my mom immediately. I wasn't living at home, and we always had interpreted dreams. And she said, "Someone you know will come close to death, but they won't touch death." And she said, "And a chipped tooth in a dream is a bad omen in the Arabic culture." So, okay. And so 2 months later, I was a passenger in a car. A friend was driving. I was a passenger, and my older brother was in the back seat. We were driving from Cleveland to New York City. And about 7 hours into the drive, I had fallen asleep reading Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, and my older brother had fallen asleep. And I woke, and the driver had lost control, probably also fallen asleep. I never actually found out. And he was swerving toward one side of the highway, and I screamed his name, and I said, "Zaydun," and he swerved to the other side and hit the railing, and the car flipped over backwards. It rolled over twice. My door flew out, and my legs flew out and got crushed between the ground and the car. I remember my head hitting the top of the car, the top of the inside of the car, and we landed, and I did awake, and my legs were crushed, and my knees looked like this, and I immediately looked for my brother, my older brother, and I screamed his name, and he had cut his arm and ear. Thank goodness nothing really happened to him. He had some stitches. I looked up to look for the driver. He was hauling down people from the street. And it's weird. I'm kind of a person who works well under pressure, I guess. But I was telling everybody what to do. So I told the driver to come down, take the seatbelt off, because I was kind of being strangled by the seatbelt. And it was the most unlucky day of my life and the luckiest day of my life. He had hauled down nurses and paramedics, and they immediately called for help. A local ambulance came, and they refused to take me because they said I was a sure amputee. Both my knees were dislocated. The arteries behind my knees were completely severed. I had a fractured tibia. I had stretched sciatic nerve in my left leg, and if anybody has been through sciatica, it's one of the worst pains to recover from. And so the lucky thing was that when you partially sever an artery, you bleed to death. When you completely sever an artery, as happens to war victims, the blood clots back up. So I lost a lot of blood, but I was alive. So then they called the local trauma center shuttle, air shuttle, one of the best trauma centers in the country. And the strangest thing I did that day, which I'll never understand, is I was in the trauma helicopter with my older brother, And he was in the cot, and I was in a cot, and we were sort of like this. And I had an oxygen mask on. And I kept lifting up my head to reach out and hold his hand. And he was kind of out of it, but I kept doing that to hold his hand. And the paramedic kept putting my head down, and every time she didn't look, I would do that again. And finally, she took the oxygen mask off me, and she said, if you keep doing that, and people fractures, you can't kind of keep moving. And she said, if you don't stop doing that, I'm gonna have to hold my hand there. And I said, just give me some potassium chloride and get it over with. Now what that means, I was a medical student, and we used to do experiments on dogs, and where we do artificial hearts and things. And at the end, we'd have to sacrifice the dog, and we would give them potassium chloride to fibrillate their heart so they would have a heart attack. So whether I was in so much pain that I couldn't stand it, or I had separated from my body, I don't know. I had underwent a miracle surgery for 12 hours, 2 cardiovascular surgeons on each leg, revascularizing my blood vessels. They had happened to be on call, and they saved my legs. I had 2 more surgeries at that trauma center, and then I was flown back to Cleveland, Ohio, where I had another 5 surgeries in a month. They kept having to clean out the debris from my legs. I was sent home after that month with 2 full leg casts hinged at the knee on a wheelchair. And while I was in the hospital, the doctor basically, they also had to shave part of the muscle out of my leg. And the doctor basically told me, he said, let's put it this way, you're not going to be a ballerina. So I was determined. I, every day, underwent intensive physical therapy. And to just spend this much with my knee every day, 1 degree, was incredibly painful. Of course, the whole hospital stay, I was on the maximum amount of morphine drip that I could have. And within 3 months, I was walking on a walker with 1 leg. I remember the first 4 steps I took across my parents' foyer, and my whole family rooting me on. Of course, my family was so incredibly supportive of that time of my life, and still. Within 6 months, I was on the tennis courts again. I was practicing with my tennis team. I used to get wheelchaired there to just watch them play, and then started playing again with leg braces and all. And I was in leg braces for probably a good 9 months, different kinds of leg braces. My family's not one to really process their feelings, so while I was all about getting back on my feet and my physical strength, internally I was imploding. I would cry for hours inwardly, and sometimes I would be in the shower crying for hours trying to soak away my scars. I think the most difficult things for me were acceptance, because I couldn't accept that this was happening to me. I kept comparing my life to how I was and who I was. All that rage and anger and grief and sadness just didn't get processed, really. I kept trying to understand how everybody else felt. Some of my friends sort of disappeared. I got a job working at a laboratory, and I was so depressed I couldn't remember what they would train me to do 5 minutes prior. So I would, just they'd tell me to do something, and then I'd have to ask them so many times, and I would lose it. I would be out of it. Funny enough, I was dating my boyfriend at the time, who's now my husband, who experienced that time of my life, and thankfully I had some redeeming qualities, so we got back together 22 years later. At that job, I was supposed to, at one point, inject a mouse. It was an HIV mouse, I think, or we were doing HIV studies. And I basically killed it. It was $1 million mouse, and or something. And the next day, needless to say, I was fired. And my boss basically said, I think you should get an automated job. So I think now, if you can only see me now. And that next day, I decided to apply for art school. Art school was always something that I loved. Art was always something that I loved. And it was really the only thing I could connect to during this time. And that led me to Italy, where I met, by the grace of God, 2 amazing South African women who are art teachers. And their whole philosophy on art is about healing, about transformation, about self-awareness, and basically about spiritual development. And they literally helped me get back on my feet, and they allowed me to just express and emote everything that I had inside of me onto the canvas. The first year, we had an exercise to do a life-size self-portrait. So it was a 6-foot-tall self-portrait. And I painted myself, it was horrible painting. I looked kind of like monstrous, and I took up the whole painting, and there was a desolate landscape field behind me. And I realized 6 months later that I had actually cut myself off at the knees. And so once I realized that, I said, I must do another self-portrait and include my whole body. And so I painted this painting. You can see how deep and serious she was. And I struggled and struggled till I finally, in about a couple hours, finally got it. And included myself. And funny enough, there's sort of this prison behind me, and that was what I wanted to put behind myself. And 2 years after that, I did a painting of the back of my legs, my scars, the back of my scars. And I don't have it here, but it's a very interesting painting because I'm standing on a stage, and in front of me is the curtain, and of course behind me is the audience. And then a couple years after that, I mentioned that the most difficult things for me were acceptance and self-pity. I felt sorry for myself for a long time. Why me, why me, why me? And finally, I was in a workshop with these women. I still study with them to this day in South Africa. And one of them told me, she said, aren't you tired of feeling sorry for yourself? And it just hit me. Yeah, I actually am. And I did a monoprint of a stairwell and an opening, sort of a light at the end of that opening. And in the meantime, my brother and I were talking about starting a tea company. And I ended up resonating with a photograph he'd had of a man that's walking down an alley with a tunnel, with a light at the end of the tunnel. And that became the signature of the Numi brand. These Oops. So finally, just to fast forward today, well, what I want to say about the paintings is that what's amazing about having worked at Numi, having a company for the last 16 years, is that an idle mind is really very sinister. So work is really good for that. And also working with my brother is amazing because he's loving and supporting. And finally, that these intimate, vulnerable paintings are all over the country and all over the world. So. This last one is something I did just last year, and it's simply a meditation to be present, and it's just counting and breathing. So, in conclusion, I just want to say I've learned so much from my experience. I think healing is an ongoing process. For one, don't take for granted life. Don't take for granted moments. Appreciate all the little things that I never appreciated before. I've been given this great gift of being able to hold other people's pain. For the past 27 years, I've met friends who have stories much more tragic than myself, and for some reason I'm able to hold them and contain them and actually help them. I've learned that showing your emotions is actually a good thing. It's a strength, not a weakness. And I think most of all, I've learned that art and life and the art of life is actually about the weakness and the fragility and the vulnerability. It's not about the chip on your shoulder, but it's about that chipped tooth. Thank you.